Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Salpi Ghazarian. I'm the director of the Institute of Armenian Studies here at SC. And we inaugurated this In Conversation series about a year and a half ago. And each time we do one, I'm even more pleased at our guests, the fact that our guests have agreed to participate, and the fact that they bring so much to the issues that we want to be talking about. The title of today's talk is Illegal Humans. And you can like the title, you can dislike the title, but at the end of the day, we live in an era where before this hour is over, another 1,700 people will become refugees, will be displaced during this hour that we will be sitting here. Half of them children. That is the era in which we live. And where these people go, what happens to them, is mostly not in their control. And the part of this that is appropriate for a university and a center of study is that this isn't just, and just is a terrible word, this isn't simply a matter of humanitarian crisis. It's also an issue of governance. It's a matter for the policymakers and for those of us who are supposed to be influencing the policymakers, either through research or through voice. And that is why we're really very pleased to have these three individuals who together represent, I think, every aspect there is about the refugee immigrant crisis that perhaps the world has always faced, but not in these numbers and not in this kind of era with this kind of technology and communication processes bringing it home to us every moment. Professor Manuel Pastor, who is the Terpanjan Chair in Civil Society and Social Change and heads, among other things, the Center for the Study of Integration and Immigration and Integration, will be the driver of this conversation. And thank you, Manuel, for accepting. And Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan, who was Mexico's ambassador to the United States, is the son and grandson of Armenian and Catalan refugees and a practitioner of public diplomacy, which means he tweets prolifically and often about the refugee situation. Professor Nubar Hovsepian, I call him the double refugee. He's an Armenian born in Egypt, extremely involved in Palestinian issues and the negotiation processes. And together they have about 45 minutes to, I don't know, either make us more confused or come up with answers that we can sell whoever is ready and willing to take them. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. This is being live streamed, and it will be up on YouTube as well.
Oh, thank you, and thank Salpi for getting us together. I know those of us on the panel will appreciate that the reason we're doing this is Salpi is an enormously persuasive person and really brings people together. I'm pleased to be with these two, Arturo Sarukhan, who is, as she mentioned, been the ambassador, Mexican ambassador to the United States, and who was born in Mexico, spent some time in England in his youth, and so he's the perfect mix for Southern California, an Armenian Mexican who speaks English with an English accent. That's just wonderful. Very Californian. And of course, Nubar Hovsepian, who is the person who, when he arrived, was able to say that he had the longest journey, not from Washington, D.C., but from Orange County, which means you made even more of a commitment to come. So I want to start by just saying that I'm struck by the enormity of the Syrian refugee crisis and, in some sense, how little attention it's getting in the United States. In preparation for this, looking at the statistics, more than half of the Syrian population is either internally displaced or refugees. 4 million are refugees. I think the numbers are 1.2 million in Lebanon now, 700,000 in Jordan, places that were already imbued with other refugees, Palestinian refugees, chased from their own lands as well. Given the scale of this crisis, why is it being paid so little attention, except for negative attention, in the United States? Let me start with Arturo.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back at USC and see my colleague from the Center for Public Diplomacy, Nick Cull. I'm a distinguished visiting professor there, so I feel that this is my home. So it's great to be in the famous Ground Zero, which I had never been to, so this is certainly a first. And to talk about an issue which is critically important for the future well-being, not only of the United States, but of countries that are either on the crossroads of a lot of these refugee and displacement and migrant flows, and an issue which sadly is poisoning the political debate, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world too, particularly in Europe. And given that the talk today has a very and given that the talk today has a very provocative title, with which I obviously disagree with in terms of labeling anyone illegal, let me start with the issue of terms of reference, because it's part of the problem that we're facing. For starters, there is a distinction between refugees and migrants. It's not only in terms of how and why you've been displaced or you're on the move, but it has profound implications for the obligations of states towards either migrants or refugees. And I think that the media in this country and in other places around the world has done a woeful job in mixing, sometimes not on purpose, but sometimes picking up the agendas of certain politicians and certain governments who want to beat the drum on the fact that these individuals, especially from Syria, coming into Europe, are migrants and not refugees. Why? Because that gets them off the hook. And I think that a lot of the media coverage and the way that they've labeled these stories and that they headline these stories, migrant crises in Europe, yes, they're migrating, but most of them are refugees. And this entails very distinct responsibilities for the countries of the European Union where these individuals are arriving from. If you're talking about the Americas, then yes, most of them, the great majority of what we see of movements in the Americas from south to north, through Mexico, into the United States, are mainly migrants. Yes, there are some cases of refugees fleeing, especially violence in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, very different stories. That's more economic, rural, whereas Honduras is much more urban and related to violence, drugs and thugs related violence. But most of what you see in the Americas is migration in its traditional sense. But I start with this because part of the challenge and part of the reason why a lot of people are not focusing on this issue is because we've been lulled into bagging these two very distinct but very important phenomena in the same bag and with the same label, and that's part of the problem.
And can you just briefly, a refugee is someone who's unable to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution.
Not only is unable to return, has left because of a reason, a deep-seated reason of fearing for their lives, or because there's persecution.
And that's different than a migrant who might be pushed by a poor economy, lured by a stronger economy.
Absolutely, and it has very different implications for nations in terms of their responsibilities to addressing these individuals once they cross over a national border.
Indeed. So, tell us a little bit about your perspective on this, and we'll probably need to pull the mic. What is it that we need to know? I think Arturo's saying very clearly that we need to understand the difference between a refugee and migrants, and then use that to understand the obligation of Europe and America. What do you think is important as this crisis has been unfolding that's not really getting out there in the news, that students need to hear about, that we all need to be paying attention to?
I spent much of my time in January in Beirut. Well, Beirut, capital of Lebanon, about 25 to 30% of the population in Lebanon today are Syrian refugees. Right? So imagine if Europe would had that problem in terms of just size, scale, right? So for me, as someone who looks at the question of the Syrian refugees, that's confounded by all sorts of things, right? In America, we don't pay attention to it, primarily because we're like an ostrich who puts its head in the sand, right? Most of these refugees, from Syria in particular, but also from Iraq, have escaped zones that are controlled by different Salafi jihadi movements. Who supports these Salafi jihadi movements? Our allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait. We supported those people, right? We created a laboratory for them to grow in Afghanistan, right? So please, America is not an innocent bystander. America has played a major role. Who's the leadership of the movement from which these people are escaping? 60% of them, at least, of ISIS, Daesh, in Iraq, are former military officers that our great Viceroy, Mr. Bremer, chose to disband the entire Iraqi army. Guess what? People who only know the skill of fighting. What do? They have to survive. They will go to the party that pays them. Right? So please, this is central to American foreign policy. We're not innocent. We are a central player in the negative sense of this question. In addition to that, the question of Syrian refugees, but not only Syrian, many others, right? I mean, I come from a refugee family, right? My grandmother took her a few years to reach from Arab Kir via Syria to end up in Cairo. I am a refugee. My grandmother was a refugee, right? And the idea of considering any notion of illegality strikes me as just being immoral, right? So that's one. Two, another issue we have in the US is this penchant towards looking at the world through a binary, us, them. W is very good at that, right? You remember him? He was president, you know. Then our current administration also tries to think in those terms, and the future administrations will do. We are the good ones, the rest of the world is not. This is what we call, in the study of politics, American exceptionalism. That's BS. You know it. I mean, our founding is an exterminationist policy of eliminating the natives. Please don't forget that central point of departure in our history. So there is an anti-Islam that is perpetuated without understanding what Islam is. I mean, look, after 9/11, more people went out to buy a copy of the Quran to try to understand what happened. Guess what? Most of them did not read it. And second, the answer is not in that bloody book. It's in the study of social movements. That's what I study. It's in the study of ideology. Right? So let's not make things simplistic. Right? The issue of refugees is a crucial one. There is a responsibility in the human rights community, this whole movement, which I have some troubles with because it brings with it foreign intervention, the right to protect, right? Under the right to protect, today Libya is what? Non-state, right? So the notion of right to protect is a problematic one. So let's make sure we need to play a role in opening doors, not only for refugees, but also for bringing a solution to the problem, right? When the money stops coming in to the various combatants, this is what happened in the ending of the civil war in Lebanon, which I lived through, a 15-year civil war. When that money was cut off, when the spigot was cut off, that means we have to pressure our allies. We have to pressure ourselves not to arm the wrong people, including authoritarian states, right? These are some of my thoughts on this matter.
Those are deep thoughts, and they've opened up a broad conversation. Arturo, I want to turn back to you about what do you think the responsibilities of the U.S. and European governments should be, particularly as this has begun to unfold? What Nubar is pointing to is the responsibility of the United States in terms of the creation of the problem. What do you think are some of the things that would be useful for the U.S. to do, useful for Europe to lead on?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is that the narrative and the range of the discussion has to change profoundly. Look at the U.S. today, look at the campaign out there. It would seem that the United States is being flooded by migrants, or is in danger of being swarmed by violent refugees, if you listen to particularly one of the GOP contenders.
Oh, who are you talking about? No, go ahead, yeah.
This is a gentleman by the name of Donald Trump, who is a fact-free walking zone, Teflon coated to hard data, and whose lips are as loose as his facts. Because when he talks about building a big fat wall on the border with Mexico, he's ignoring how profoundly those migration patterns from Mexico to the United States have changed in the past 5 years. Yes. Zero net migration, which means basically more people are going back to Mexico than Mexicans coming to the United States. And it's the result of a combination of factors. It has to do with how dangerous the border has become because of the presence of transnational organized crime, very violent transnational organized crime that is not only moving drugs and weapons in both directions, but is now muscling its way into the business of human trafficking. But it also has to do with an economy in the United States, particularly in construction and services, which after 2009 flatlined. But it also has to do with a Mexican economy that has been growing the past decade, probably not at the rates that Mexico would need to grow to be able to bridge those economic asymmetries that still persist between Mexico and the United States, but at a relatively healthy 2.3, 2.4 annual rate of growth. And this is transforming Mexico and creating a middle class that has been slowly growing and expanding, which is also changing those factors of expulsion of migrants seeking a better life or a better paid job in the U.S. So,
I mean, not to speak of the massive decline in fertility rates in Mexico.
The demographic
40 years
change
ago,
in Mexico.
40 years ago, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. Now it's 2.3 over the course of a lifetime. It's 1.7 in the United States. And that's one of the reasons why...
Birth rate in the U.S. today is 2.4. In Mexico, it's 2.2.
Yeah.
So there's a very profound change happening there. So the first thing I would say is we have to tackle whether it's refugees or migrants with the facts. Not with fiction, not with populism. And I see what's happening here in this campaign, and I'm very concerned, because being the son of Catalan refugees who fled the civil war after Franco won, and being the grandson of Armenian refugees who fled the genocide, history has shown us what happens when we allow nativist populists to gain power. And we have to push back, and we have to push back with the facts. So the initial piece of this is, both in Europe and in the United States, we have to look at these issues with facts. The second issue is that some of the policies have not worked. The United States thought that by building a fence along the border with Mexico, you could profoundly transform the dynamics of undocumented and authorized immigration across the border. What ended up happening after 1985, 1987, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Guardian during the Clinton administration, and then was deepened as a result of post 9/11 security, was that by enhancing security on the border, you broke a phenomenon which had always occurred along the border between Mexico and the United States, which was circular mobility in labor flows. People would come, work, and cross back into Mexico, and then the next year they would come all over again. Given that it was much harder to cross the border, what changed was not that more and more people were coming over, it's that more and more people decided to stay put because it was so much harder going back and forth as they used to. So that's when absolute numbers of undocumented Mexicans started rising in the United States during the previous decade. In Europe, Operation Mare Nostrum, which was probably very successful at the beginning, started getting tinkered with by both bureaucrats in Brussels and national governments over budget, over responsibility, and over burdens that were being shared by European governments. And suddenly an operation that had more or less been able to, in a humane and also successful fashion, confront the challenge of migration from Africa, from northern Africa, basically economic, to Europe, started collapsing, and it coincided with the dreadful, dramatic crises that we've seen in Syria for the past 4 or 5 years. So suddenly you have both a refugee and a migration challenge converging on the Mediterranean into Europe.
Dramatic changes, and I want to get back to the question of Mexican migration in just a bit as well. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what you think. You talked a lot about what's gone wrong. What do you think the responsibilities are of European governments and the United States to provide some leadership on this issue? Arturo talked about changing the narrative, talked about changing some kinds of policies. What do you think is the forward-looking strategies you would be recommending at this point?
See, I don't think it's just European countries and the US. I think Arab countries bear a major responsibility, right?
Yes, that's true.
So that, number one, let's work on our allies. Saudi Arabia, pay up. And then, if you go and experience the life of a refugee, Syrian refugee in Lebanon, and then you say, why did this kid, 18-year-old, choose to risk their life, and some of them lost their lives, right, trying to cross by boat from one of the Greek islands, right? So the question is, the way they are herded with zero ability to work, at least legally, makes it impossible to retain a basic element of dignity. If you have no dignity, death is more important than dignity. You risk death, right? So the point I would suggest, the US, Europe, through the United Nations, I mean, all of a sudden we have the budgets of the various institutes, UNHCR, etc. They just don't have the budget to deal with the refugees in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in parts of Syria, because there are areas where, and in Turkey. Let's increase those budgets. That's a responsibility. That's a priority. When you do so, you actually contribute to preventing refugees from making the journey, right? Imagine yourself as an individual who's making that journey. What is your yearning, your prayer at night? That you can go back home. Not to go to Oslo or Stockholm or London or Bremen. It's to go home. But the concept of home doesn't exist. A 5-year-old today in a kindergarten that is run by an NGO where my daughter worked for 2.5 years doesn't know what home is as a concept. Right? The responsibility is to provide a human quality, dignity for people to survive, and to say to the Lebanese government, to say to the Saudi government, you're going to have to play a role. You don't want to bring people in? At least pay a role to create businesses, small businesses for these people to survive with dignity. I think that's the route.
Yeah, and if I may, you've hit on a very important point, which is that this isn't a blame game. Because as countries in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf have a responsibility to mitigate some of the factors that come along with these refugee flows, there's little that can be done right now, and especially after what has happened in Geneva over Syria, but there's a lot of mitigation policies that can succeed. The same is valid for countries in Latin America that have been traditionally migrant expulsion countries. And so unless we start changing the paradigm, and we also convince our own societies of one very important, crucial historical fact, which is if you look at, in the course of human history, the success of nations has depended on human connections. And unless we change the way people understand what these immigrants and what these refugees bring to our societies, we're going to be always pushing back against the populists, whether they're in Hungary or they're in Manhattan?
So speaking of Manhattan, in some sense, Donald Trump did us an enormous favor by connecting his fear and contempt for Mexican migrants with his fear and contempt for Syrian refugees, and sort of exposed the underbelly of demographic anxiety that seems to be driving the reaction in the United States. It's certainly connected to foreign policy issues, but you're right, it's so fact-free. How much undocumented immigrants contribute to the economy? The fact, as you mentioned, that over 60% of them have been in the country now for longer than 10 years. They're really undocumented, for example, in our state, Californians, right? So fundamentally, we're dealing with a kind of anxiety also about the country, the United States itself changing demographically and the anxiety it provokes. That's a tough, tough issue. How do you think we can tackle that and get into what really needs to be an open and honest conversation about race and difference in the United States that winds up driving really irrational policies around refugees and migrants?
Again, part of the answer is hard data and statistics, and I know that statistics are sometimes right up there with damn lies, but we have to use hard data to prove those who would argue otherwise wrong. Trump and other members of the far right wing of the Republican Party that have been banging their drum on how migrants suck away from or free riders in terms of sort of education services and health services in the United States. This is baloney. Undocumented immigrants in this country pay into social services and Social Security billions of dollars a year. There are $17 billion of unclaimed Social Security services which migrants will never be able to tap into because they're undocumented. They're using false ITIN numbers, they're using false Social Security numbers. Most of them get their Social Security retained when they get paid, but they're never going to be able to claim that. So, you know, this whole argument of, oh, they're free riders and they're sucking the system dry, you know, hold on, guys. So, again, I think part of the equation is how we use data and how we explain that data. The other piece is much more difficult and much more uncomfortable because it challenges our own visions of who we are as Americans or Mexicans or French or Dutch or whatever. And that's a much harder conversation, especially when you have profound changing demographics and a phenomenon which is occurring across the world in most industrialized nations, which is the obliteration of the middle classes. In societies where most feel that their kids will no longer have the opportunities and the social mobility that they and their parents had before them. And this creates a very complex and in some cases very toxic environment in which this conversation is taking place.
I think that's true, and it's certainly the reaction you're seeing from the German right is this concern, not that xenophobia that's driving it, but also a concern about will we be able to sustain the economy with this many new refugees or migrants. With these kind of difficult issues about race and demographic change driving so much of the anxiety around our policies, how do you think we should open up that conversation?
See, I think there is something that is not part of the political discourse at all. That is, how has the way we produce and we accumulate wealth changed in the last 30, 35 years? You know, in the latest phase of what we might dub as globalization, right? And it strikes me that there are two patterns. One, capital has become infinitely more mobile. The mobility of capital requires an equally mobile labor force. So we have states like the Philippines that actually has a ministry to try to see how many of their citizens will be shipped off overseas so that they can send their remittances back home. a formal ministry, right? Now, when Californians with a racist persuasion refer to undocumented illegals, guess who's laughing? Agribusiness. Because agribusiness wants all of that undocumented labor. They need it, without which agribusiness in California would not survive. Right? So I think we have to confront, there is the connection between race and class. You mentioned the middle class. Well, the middle class is sinking. And that's not only in the advanced industrial countries. Actually, it's also sinking in the rising states, Brazil, right? You know, the next group of states, as well as, at least in the Middle East and South Asia, the areas that I follow the data, that middle class is sinking as well. That is, there is a polarization of wealth. There is a process of immiseration. So we have to deal with it simply by first saying that, since when is America established as a white country? It never was. We assume it was. Why are there non-white faces here? Well, the first Muslims who came on slave ships. And Edward Said's students used some of that material to write some really great books. They found them in the archives in the South, right? So Islam is very old, and by the way, the majority of Muslims in America are African Americans. They're not, you know, your foreign imported folks. So the diversity of a society is a given. We have to hark on it. White privilege is real. We have to teach about it. And this is not being PC. I don't believe. What is PC now is that the market delivers everything. That's BS. That's the business school teaches that. I oppose that in my courses. Right? The market doesn't resolve anything. It causes more immiseration. I think we need to have blunt talk. Blunt talk about these questions.
Well, I think you've certainly given us a little bit of blunt talk. So I want to see, I've got 2 more questions that'll help close this, but I want to see if there's a question or 2 from the floor. Why don't you come up and use the microphone?
And I've just seen that it says Ground Zero Performance Cafe, so I hope we're performing here.
Yes, indeed, you've been performing beautifully. My name is Professor Dr. Simon Simonian, and I'm very impressed by the facts that we are hearing in contrast to the fiction we hear in the newspapers and the television and radio. The question about capitalism, which is really eliminating the middle class and keeping the wealth in the top 1%, or, you know, if your numbers more than 1% perhaps, and the poverty that's going on. How can we control or tame capitalism, which is so popular from the days of Hume of Scotland, when he thought the laissez-faire type, you know, the markets would adjust things, but it hasn't happened. How can we create rules, laws in the advanced countries of the world where capitalism doesn't destroy the rest of the population?
See, one of the basic principles of capitalism, as Joseph Schumpeter put it, is creative destruction. Right? And then later people like a Polish extract who's now retired in England, writing on Zygmunt Bauman, where he says, look, capitalism produces human waste. We know what we do with waste, we dispose it. So do we dispose with human waste? How? When a large class of people becomes superfluous. Right? So the question we have for us is to look in comparative terms across historical times. Let me suggest, when we look at the New Deal in America, a very imperfect time, right? There's Jim Crow, racism and all that, right? But at least on the economic pact, there was a pact between labor, capital, and the state. That pact was destroyed ultimately and put in the coffin through Thatcher-Reagan. Okay. Is it conceivable, as the likes of, say, Joseph Stiglitz, former World Bank official and Clinton the chief economist, saying that we can reform the system? Is social democracy possible? Well, we look at Canada, we look at Europe, we know that at least on the level of equality, they're infinitely more equal. There is less inequity there than we have here. We have greater wealth here, but infinitely greater inequity. There are models. I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden capitalism will disappear, but all laws, all societies must learn how to regulate. Capitalism wants nobody to regulate itself. And what do we get? Depression and the last economic fight. No. Regulations to ensure our rights as citizens. Because ultimately we are citizens, we have to make that demand.
So let me say a word on that, and then I'll ask the last two questions at the same time for each of you, because as we understand, the students will depart promptly at 1. One thing I would say is that it's important to realize that this level of inequality has become dysfunctional for the system. We're having inadequate demand to move the economy forward. We're inadequately educating the next generation. And when we leave so many people who are undocumented and their children sort of in fear of deportation, insecure, their ability to develop their human capital to contribute to the economy is limited. When you see all these tremendously talented Syrian refugees who are not able to find a place to start businesses or find jobs, we're really wasting human capital. And I think we've really gotten to the point where the level of inequality is now actually corrosive for economic growth in the same way that it's always been corrosive for political society. I want to ask you to close on a question, and I'll answer it as well. You got an audience here of USC folks. What can people do about this, and what gives you hope? We'll start with you, Arturo.
What can people do? I think drive a different conversation and try and change the terms of that conversation. Try to push back on those who would like to close this country. The strength of this nation has always been built on diversity, on inclusion, despite the significant whether economic or social or political challenges that this country faces. I've always said that one of the issues that some of us sometimes lose when we talk about the 1% economy is that it's also becoming a 1% democracy. For a number of reasons that has to do with Citizens United, gerrymandering, and the balkanization of public opinion in this country. But the problem is, whether you see it on the left or on the right, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party, citizens of this country and of other countries around the world are feeling increasingly not represented by public policy and governments and political parties. They feel that traditional political parties no longer are conveyor belts between their aspirations, their views, and public policy. And that's a problem that we're seeing in the United States, but elsewhere. So hopefully changing the terms of reference of the conversation, and hopefully based on real, hard data. What gives me hope? What this country has always given me hope, that it's a country that is always able to reinvent itself. If I was cheekier, I'd say, as Churchill said, it's a country that does the right thing after exhausting all the possible alternatives. But I think that the diversity, the ability to reinvention in this country is what gives me a lot of hope.
Great. Nubar, what can people do in the audience?
I can't presume to answer the question of what people do. That's, it's fascinating. It's a very American question. People have to decide what they will do, right? I'm not here to tell you what to do. I can't. I mean, that's presumptuous, right? You will find ways through various forms of activism. In academia, we can encourage the development of the social sciences humanities, in which the question of what ought be is raised, as opposed to purely an engineering answer to a problem. Right? That is a human-centric problem. We have in my university a peace studies program that is based on justice and dignity, to promote these types of programming at a time when the university is becoming increasingly contributing to the technologization of education, and therefore education is not taking place.
So I'll say a word and then a word of thanks. I was glad to be part of this conversation because I learned a little bit about who each of you would be. I was glad to be part of this conversation because the Institute is an institute I always want to support. And also because I was profoundly moved by the title, Illegal Humans, Refugees, Immigrants, and Neighbors. Profoundly moved because my father actually came to the United States in the 1930s, as I always say, with papers that were imperfect. And when World War II came, he was given the choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army. And the story is true. He couldn't figure out what to do, and he gave a penny to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it, and that was how the choice was made. My dad went to the war, he and the penny came back safe, and a generation later his son is a full professor at the University of Southern California. And what I always say is that's a great story, it's an American story. In some ways it's the wrong story. It's the wrong story because what it doesn't account for is not just our family and their desires to get ahead, but also the fact that there were public policies in place that made it possible. My dad had a route to citizenship through service in the military. When he was undocumented, his rights were protected by a union, particularly at work. When he came back from the war, he was given assistance with the GI Bill, to go to community college, and to buy a house. And when I was growing up, there was public education to make sure that I could actually succeed. And when I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz, at that time, there was affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile. And what we don't realize is that if we want to move from refugees and illegal immigrants to the last word in this title, neighbors, it is a question that those who are striving themselves have to strive. But it's also a question and responsibility on us to create the kinds of public policies that will foster the entrepreneurship that you were talking about, that will regularize the situation of undocumented immigrants, that will provide the possibilities for people to contribute to a better and healthier America and whole world in terms of society. I'm inspired to do more of that kind of work by listening to the work that you do, and I really want to thank you all for coming. Let's give them a big round of applause for their insights. And Salpi will be pleased that we ended at 1 p.m. exactly.
Your German-Cuban roots are showing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. Inspiring and fact-filled and extremely thoughtful. Thank you very, very much. This morning driving over, I decided I wasn't going to focus on this topic anymore. I needed to disconnect. So my idea of disconnecting is listening to the BBC NewsHour. And the lead story was that in Aleppo, the district where I grew up was bombed this morning. And we lived there because my grandfathers had been killed in the genocide. My grandmothers were refugees, and I wasn't there because I was the migrant in the 60s. And the only reason that I'm a neighbor is to continue Manuel Pastor's theme, and this is something that, Manuel, you've said in the past, is that the difference between integration and remaining the other is the way in which migrants are accepted or not. You know, and again, this is your observation, in the Latino community, the way the Cuban emigres were accepted versus the way the Central Americans were accepted is completely different, and the outcomes are different. My generation of Syrian immigrant, refugee, whatever we were here in the 60s, was very different from what we're seeing today. And it's the difference between neighbor and not neighbor. So, thank you. A commercial. February 11th, that's next Thursday, our guest is Viken Cheterian, who has just published a book called Open Wounds, The Last 100 Years in Armenian-Turkish Relations. And Viken is a Geneva-based journalist, academic, who doesn't write about genocide and history and archives, but he writes about what happens after genocide. How do two neighbor countries try to live together? How have they tried? Have they tried at all? And it's a fascinating discussion, really, about political trauma. And we hope you do come. And thank you very much again. This will be up on YouTube. We hope you'll share it with your friends. I think this was an amazing conversation. Thanks again. Thank you.